Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESGCV. My name is LaQuantia Goodman, and I am today's moderator. If you're just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourselves with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for public record. Office hours recordings are on the HCD ESG webpage under Technical Assistance and Training. A copy of the slide deck and recording will also be emailed to you by your grant administrator or annual representative. Next slide. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESGCV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the question and answer session. Slide 3. Today's office hour session agenda includes the following: ESG and ESGCV updates, office hours updates, upcoming trainings, ESG, ESGCV question and answer, and today's spotlight session, documentation clinic, part 2. I will now hand it over to Sarah for our ESG updates.
Thank you, LaQuantia. Good morning, everyone. Just a few updates. The NOFA applications for the 2022, of course, they were released June 13th. Remember, all applications are due by August 17th. Webinar presentations and FAQs, we have had a little bit of a setback with trying to get those posted. If you need the links to the webinar presentations, I have the direct link for the YouTube page. Just email our ESG NOFA inbox, which we will drop the email in the chat for you. Next slide, please. And on our ESG webpage, if you have not already visited our webpage, it does look a little bit different. So our webinars and our FAQs will actually be under the Notice of Funding tab, which is all the way to the left there. Next slide, please. 2020 annual contracts. The expenditure deadline has already passed. It was July 7th. Make sure to get your final request for funds to your ESG representative no later than August 24th. This allows ample time for us to be able to process, including our accounting department, so you can get paid. Any request received past August 24th, we cannot guarantee payment. So please make sure that you are turning those in on time. If you are done spending, you do not have any other expenses to claim, make sure that you are turning in your certification of closeout form and return that back to your rep so that we can complete the disencumbrance process. 2021 ESG contracts, we already have all 19 of the COC contracts in internal routing. 10 of those 19 are executed. If you currently have a pending 213 in your queue to sign, please make sure that you get that back to us as soon as possible so our contracts office can execute that agreement. We anticipate that the rest of the balance of state will all start routing internally no later than the next 10 days. Next slide, please. ESG policy documents, just to remind you, we do have the resources tab on our webpage. There are 2 new policies as well, which is the ESG VAWA compliance policy and the ESG equipment acquisition and disposition policy. I encourage you to download and read them so we all stay consistent. Next slide, please. APRs, I know we're going to continue to keep saying this. There are still quite a few ESG annual projects reports that are missing. Remember, it is better to turn in a late report than to have a missing report, especially if you are going to be applying under the balance of state competitive application process. The points that are deducted for having missing reports is higher than having a late report. So please make sure that you get your ESG projects report in if you have not already done so. It is required for all open contracts between that reporting period. So it doesn't necessarily mean that that is your entire amount that you were awarded. The next sections that are coming up that are due, workbooks that are due, is the APR itself and the cost expenditures workbook. Those cost expenditure workbooks only reflect charges from July 1st through June 30th. Next slide, please. So just to remind you, the APR workbook is due no later than August 1st, and those individual APR cost workbooks are due by August 1st as well. If you have any questions in regards to filling these out, please make sure that you email your rep or email us at the ESG NOFA inbox. Next slide, please. And of course, our ESG team members, reps, is Diana Prado, Giovanni Martinez, Tuesday Cole, Sam Liu, and Anthony Zapata. I was a rep until yesterday. I am now the ESG program manager. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. My current contracts I will still be keeping as I transition into my new role over the next few weeks. If you have any questions, remember you can always reach us at the ESG NOFA inbox. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. And back to you, LaQuantia.
Thank you, Sarah. Now I have just a few ESG CV updates and reminders. The Q7 financial report is due Friday by 5 p.m. If you haven't completed your report, you may do so by using the link here. HCD will start discussions with subrecipients on an individual basis to determine contract amendments to extend the ESG CV performance period beyond September 30th, 2022. ESG CV RFF reminders. Next slide, please. When filling out the description for each line item cost, indicate which location / subrecipient the line items are for. For example, as indicated here, for emergency shelter, you have a direct cost, utilities, and then you have the date. In that description, you have gas and electric utilities for shelter provider number 1, number 2, and number 3. Street outreach cell phone line item is for client cell phones. Staff cell phones should go under case management or engagement costs. And the depreciation is either an administration or an indirect cost. Please refer to this slide or ask your grant administrator if you have questions. Next slide, please. HCD office hours updates. Upcoming office hour topics are: next week, we have engagement with tribal nations. On July 27th, homeless prevention program methodologies and case studies. August 3rd, preparing for a COVID surge. And August 10th, invoice review clinic. Next slide. And actually, this slide and the next slide are slides that detail upcoming trainings for this month. Please use those slides and register, use the link embedded in the slide to register for those trainings if you haven't done so already. Next slide. And then the next one. Here are our COVID response resources. Please use these resources as needed. Next slide. And here you'll find our ESG resource links. They are provided for you to use as needed as well. Next slide. Do we have any questions at this time? Hearing none, and I don't think that there are any in the chat. So now I will hand it over to Marion and Shavana for today's Spotlight Series documentation.
Sorry,
Yes.
there is one question that I was
Okay.
getting an answer to that I didn't get to from Eleanor. We were asking about on the job form if the expensive cell phone is for staff cell phones or participants. So on the job form, that cell phone line item is just for client or participant cell phones. Your staff cell phone costs, just like on the RFF, would go under your engagement or case management line items. So on the job form, it's just client cell phones that you're reporting in that cell phone line item. And Melissa, yes, we'll be emailing out the slides to everyone that attended. Sorry, LaQuania, thank you.
No problem. Thank you for answering. Next slide. I will now hand it over to Marion and Shavana for today's Spotlight Series, Documentation Clinic, Part 2.
Good morning, everyone. Go ahead, Shavana, and kick us off.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you, LaQuantia. Today is part 2 of Documentation Clinic. My name is Shavana McCaleb. I am a grant administrator for ESG CV. My pronouns are she, her.
And hello, everyone. My name is Marion Goldburn, and I'm also a grant administrator using pronouns she and her. And I will turn it over to Shavana to kick us off.
Thank you, Marion. Next slide, please. Today, we will go over the eligible line items for each funding component and the supporting documentation that is needed when submitting an RFF. I will start us off with going over eligible line items for reimbursement for emergency shelter. As you can see here on the slides, we have case management. This is going to be your case managers, staff salaries, childcare, cost of daycare provided to clients, education services. This is education services for clients, educational costs provided to clients outlined in the budget guideline. Some examples of that could be the GED, English as a second language, and as a second language. Next, employment assistance and job training. This is the cost of expenses with on-the-job training, literacy training, books, and instructional materials. We also have outpatient health services. These costs are for direct outpatient treatment of medical conditions that are provided by a licensed medical professional. Some examples of this would be cost of client's medical exam with a doctor or ER visit. It is also important to know that childcare must be provided by a licensed childcare provider. Childcare is for program participants with children 13 years and under, unless there is a disability, and then it can be for 18 years and younger. Next slide, please. Still continuing with emergency shelter, we have legal services. This is for matters for the program participants that may hinder them from obtaining retaining housing. and it should be by someone who is an attorney and licensed and is in good standing with the bar. Some of those legal services that can be provided is for child support, guardianship, paternity, emancipation, and legal separation. Those are just some of the examples in which can be covered under that line item. Next is life skills training, cost of technical, cost of teaching critical life management skills to clients. Next is your mental health services. This should also be by a licensed professional. Substance abuse training. This is cost of substance abuse training. The expenses can only be reimbursed if other substance abuse treatment services are unavailable. It is important also to note for substance abuse treatment services that this is for outpatient use and up to 30 days. Transportation services. This is travel costs for a client to and from medical care, employment, childcare, or essential services facilities. Within the transportation services, this also includes for the agency, the purchasing of a vehicle and or leasing a vehicle. And some of those that are included that you are able to be reimbursed for are gas, insurance, taxes, and maintenance. Next slide, please. Maintenance on, this is still continuing with emergency shelter. You are able to be reimbursed for maintenance on the shelter. This can include things such as plumbing expenses, door repairs. Next is your rent. This is the rent that you may incur for leasing out office space for the emergency shelter. Security is for wages paid to a security guard at the shelter or security alarm system. The vaccine incentives, we know is up to $50 per dose for eligible program participants to receive that are receiving the COVID-19. It is important to note here as well that this is cannot be retroactive. So this would be at the time that the program participant is receiving that vaccine dose. Equipment. Assets acquired with ESGCV funds that has a useful life at least 1 year per unit cost of $5,000 or more. Insurance, this is your shelter insurance on the building. Utilities include your electric, water, gas, trash utility for the shelter. Food purchase for the shelter. Furnishings, this can be the bedding, any furniture that you are in need of to put inside of the shelter. Supplies or your toiletries for the shelter. Shelter vouchers, we know that it is included under, you can pay for a client for hotel motel shelter for the client. And then your PPE is your face mask, hand sanitizer. Next slide, please. Also with emergency shelter is your renovation. Things, this may also include major rehab things. It is important to note here that you are eligible line items is your labor, your materials, the tools, other costs for renovation. It is important to note that if you are purchasing materials, for renovation, those must be purchased by the end of the grant. They do not have to be used by then, but they must be purchased, but still within using those materials you purchased within a reasonable time frame. Temporary emergency shelter. This is through leasing of an existing property. Temporary structures or other means that will help to prevent, prepare for, and respond to and mitigate the impacts of COVID-19. Next slide, please. Continue on with street outreach. Also is eligible line items is your engagement personnel. This is your engagement staff that may go out and engage with the unsheltered. Services for special population is going to be services for homeless youth, victim services, and services for people living with HIV/AIDS. Again, you have case management line item. This is staff salary for the case managers. Emergency health. This is going to be, again, it must be provided, it's outpatient and must be provided by a licensed medical professional. Your emergency mental health is also by a licensed medical person with a licensed professional of mental health conditions. Next, your transportation. This is transportation for you transporting your outreach clients to and from appointments. Vaccine incentives is also under street outreach and up to $50 per dose, and your PPE. Next slide, please. Continuing with street outreach is hazard pay. Hazard pay is for staff providing essential services directly tied to ESG/CV activity in close proximity to people with COVID or in locations with a high likelihood of contracting COVID. You also, with the waiver, you can purchase hand washing stations and portable bathrooms. This will be for your unsheltered in street outreach. And then laundry services. One of the waivers is also that you may purchase a laundry truck to go out and help those who are unsheltered. Next slide, please. And so we come to our first polling question. And so we ask that if you would, please participate. We cannot see who is putting in what answer. And this one is a true and false. A program participant that is housed using ongoing rapid rehousing rental assistance is not considered homeless for purposes of remaining eligible for other permanent housing placements. And so we will give you just a few seconds to cast your vote. Okay, it looks like we have a good number of folks who have answered. We have 43% for option 1, and 47% for option 2, and 10% for not sure. And so we will go ahead and show you the answer. Next slide, please. The answer is option 2, false. It is important to note that although the program participants in rapid rehousing are considered homeless for purposes of eligibility for other programs, the housing itself is still considered permanent housing. Therefore, these program participants are not considered homeless for counting purposes and must not be included in the COC's sheltered point and time count. And now I will hand it over to Marian.
Thank you so much, Shavonna. All right, so we are going ahead and continue with our documentation, and we'll move right on to the next project type, which is the rapid rehousing. And so let's talk about some of these eligible items that are for reimbursement. So we know that application fees are sometimes required. And so if this application fee is required from the landlord or the property manager, it is eligible under the rapid rehousing component. So are security deposits. And so security deposits, because of the real estate law in California, we cannot pay more than 2 months rent. So even though HUD, the waiver may allow for additional social security deposits to be paid, we have to keep in mind that we need to stay within that 2 times the rent for the security deposit. Last month's rent, sometimes we know we have to use some leverage in getting our participants housed. So if, landlord property manager is saying that, it's not looking like this participant can be housed, we can use last month's rent, offer this, as leverage. So it's the cost of the last month's rent for a client's unit it should be paid at the time that the security deposit is paid. So you can't go back and pay it after. Utility deposits. Sometimes the utility companies do require some deposits to be paid before these utilities can be turned on. And so we can go ahead and use these ESGCB funds to do that. The utility payments is also an eligible expense. And so it is good to note that utilities include gas, electric, water, or sewage. So cable, unfortunately, is not considered a utility, or telephone. So cable, telephone, those would not be considered utilities. We can also pay short and medium-term rent. So we know for some participants, they will require an ongoing rental assistance, until they're able to pay on their own. So we can pay this, and we can also pay any arrears that may occur, once they are eligible for rapid rehousing services. Under the waivers, the ESGCB waivers, we can also pay the PPE, the vaccine incentives, and the hazard pay that Shavonna mentioned for the emergency shelter and the street outreach. So it should be noted that the maximum amount that can be provided for staff hazard pay is 50% of their hourly rate or equivalent, in addition to their regular wage. And the regular wage should be billed under essential services, while the bonus, which is the hazard pay of up to 50% of their hourly rate, should be charged under the hazard pay line item. And it's very important to break these out when you are submitting for reimbursement, because they need to be recorded for when we are doing our to HUD. And so we want to make sure that for your financial assistance, that you assess each household to determine what the type, amount, and duration of this assistance should look like. And so we know it's not a one size fit all for each household. So we don't want to give too much assistance and enable the household. And we also don't want to give too little assistance. So in your policies and procedure manuals, we would definitely recommend not to make it, too stringent, where you're saying you're only going to offer 3 months rent, rental assistance to every household. Make it as broad, and, use words such as, we will assess, and they will be assisted on a as needed basis. And that way that will give you enough room to say if a household needs 6 months assistance, 9 months, a year, you will be protected under your policies and procedures. Next slide, please. Okay, so application fees. Well, we discussed that before. We're going to move on to the landlord incentive, which is also came about as a result of the ESGCB waiver. And so this, again, is a great incentive in getting individuals housed, especially those who may be difficult to house. And so with the landlord incentives, you can use this on the both rapid rehousing and homeless prevention. And you can pay the landlords, this should not exceed 3 times the rent that's charged for the unit. And so you can offer sign-on bonuses up to 2 months, along with the security deposits up to 2 months, and then any costs to repair damages by the participant that it may not be covered by the security deposit. And it is worthwhile to note that this is while the participant is staying in the unit. So the cost of the repair, you can't do this if the participant is no longer in the unit. And you can also pay for extra cleaning or maintenance. Again, remember these funds are CV funds, so we know that extra cleaning, maintenance may be necessary. Moving costs is another expense that's eligible under rapid rehousing. And so moving costs can include a truck rental or using a moving company on behalf of an eligible program participant that is eligible for homeless prevention or rapid rehousing assistance. And so temporary storage fee up to 3 months is also an eligible cost. Please note that the eligibility of the participant is that the fees needs to occur after the participant is enrolled. So we won't be able to pay any storage fees that are in arrears prior to the participant meeting the eligibility and being enrolled in your rapid rehousing project. Housing search and placement. We may need to hire staff that will assist with helping the participants to find housing. And so this is an eligible cost. It can be the salary and wage for your housing search and placement staff. And this might be a staff person that's separate from the person that's providing the case management service, or you might be splitting a time between housing search and placement and case management. And so if that is the case, you want to make sure that that is spelled out in your reimbursement, that the staff time is either they're 100% dedicated to the ESG project for that particular line item, or their time is split between the housing search and placement or the case management. So rapid rehousing and homeless prevention may have some of the similar eligible line items. Rapid rehousing participants are literally homeless in terms of meeting the homeless eligibility. And while homeless prevention can also include those participants that are at risk of homelessness. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is for prevention, homeless prevention. Again, you will see a similar line item. So for prevention, you want to make sure that you are serving participants that are already housed. And so that's one of the primary difference between the rapid rehousing and the homeless prevention project type. So again, you will see similar line items, but you want to make sure that eligibility is established so that you can be providing the eligible services, whether it's under rapid rehousing or homeless prevention. Next slide, please. So again, these are similar expenses, the landlord incentives, the moving costs. The same rule applies for the expenses that we discussed earlier for rapid rehousing, applies to prevention in terms of the examples of the expenses. Next slide, please. All right, so before I go into HMIS, want to mention that the rent reasonableness and the FMR requirements do not apply when a program participant receives only the financial assistance for housing stabilization service or arrears. In part one, we went over in detail what the rent reasonableness and FMR requirements are, what the forms look like. So if you missed that training, we would definitely recommend going back and listening to the recording and the slides to kind of catch you up on what the documentation should look like. And for the homeless prevention, you may have a prevention client contribution policy where you have the participants do a cost share. So if the participants have income and they are able to contribute to the payment of their ongoing monthly rent, we definitely recommend that they start doing that. You know, that way that will get them prepared for when these assistance are ending, the financial assistance are ending, that they would, have, practice of what it looks like to, to be paying these expenses on their own. All right, so now we are going to move on to Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS. And so we know that we need equipment, right? In order for all this work that we're doing, it needs to be documented. We have reports that we need to submit to HUD. So the staff can purchase or lease computer hardware in order to do the data entry for the HMIS reporting. And they can also purchase software or any software license that may be needed in order to complete this work. We know that equipment is also necessary. So any leasing of the equipment, this includes the telephones, any fax. You may have an office for your HMIS staff, and so you may need some furnitures, for these offices that would be eligible if it's the HMIS staff and that is using these furniture. You may need to pay utilities for these the office space that you're using to conduct the HMIS activities. So you put that under the utilities phone line item under HMIS. And the leasing of the office space is an eligible HMIS. And again, for your HMIS personnel, if it's a shared office space, your staff is using or being paid from other grants, again, you would do a percentage cost allocation in order to break out what percentage is eligible to be requested for reimbursement under HMIS. Your data entry person, we know that some of our providers are serving a large volume of participants, and so they may have dedicated HMIS personnel that are entering the data, reviewing the data, monitoring, doing data analysis. And so you can hire, data entry personnel, whether it's 100% dedicated or, percentage. And when it's safe to do so, we have some of our agencies that have staff that may need to actually travel to conduct the intakes, to attend any HUD-sponsored trainings, or to do some in-person monitoring. And so you can reimburse for any staff costs that may come up as a result. You may also pay for the cost of any contribution to the HMIS designated by the COC that you're using. So if there are any costs that are associated with that, you can use ESG-CB funds to pay for those. Next slide, please. All right, so this will bring us to our second poll. And this is regarding proof of payment backup documentation. So the question is as follows. Which of the following is not appropriate proof of payment for backup documentation? And option 1 is bank statement. Option 2 is canceled check. Option 3 is official payroll system report or pay stubs. And option 4 is the agency's internal report or an agency Excel document. So we have launched a poll. Again, as Shavonna stated earlier, we cannot see who is selecting what option. So we appreciate your participation, and we'll give it a few seconds before we close the poll. All right. So I see about 65% voted that option 4 the agency's internal report or Excel document is not an appropriate proof of payment. And go to the next slide, please. So yes, so we understand that sometimes you may want to send your internal financial reports as proof of payment, but we do need to see official proof of payment. And so these include your canceled checks, your bank statements. If it is for payroll for staff and you use an official payroll reporting system, we will accept that as official documentation. All right, thank you for participating, and I will now turn it back over to Shavana.
Thank you, Marion. Next slide. For the sake of time, we want because we want to be respectful of everyone's time, these next few slides we will go through kind of quickly. We won't read everything. And just as a reminder, the slides will be emailed out to you. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us or your GA. Next slide, documentation of payment. I'd like to say, I'm sorry, Taylor, if you can go back one more, that when submitting the reimbursement, it should tell a story. When the expense incurred, your invoice / receipt, your proof of payment, and then you submit for the reimbursement. Next slide, please. This is your supporting documentation that you will need to provide for each of the line items. So for staff compensation, we know that those are timesheets. Something I would like to mention is that your timesheet, it should be signed off on by your supervisor and the staff. It does not mean that it has to be printed out, signed, or physical. However, electronically is fine. And on your timesheets, the percentage in which the employee is dedicated to the ESG/CV activity should be noted on your documentation when submitting it. Fringe benefits, that includes your employment insurance, pensions, etc. Something you may submit with that is your invoice, receipts, or purchase order. If you are submitting the entire one, that your document with all employees on there, something that you may want to do is just highlight which employee you are paying the fringe benefit for. That will allow your GA to help review your reimbursement in a timely and efficient manner. Next slide, please. This is your rent. Your rent costs for the facility exclusively used for ESG must be documented with lease rent agreement. Something to note is if you are not using that facility for 100% ESG/CV activity, then you must be able to show the percentage between ESG/CV and your other funding source. Next slide, please. These are your utilities and your security. This is for your utilities for the office space and your security for the office space in which you are using for the ESG/CV activity. Next slide, please. Next is your maintenance for the facility, your hotel motel vouchers, and your vaccine incentives. Next slide, please. And I will turn it back over to Marion. Marion, I believe you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Shavana. Taylor, before we continue with this slide, can you go back one slide, please? So just want to mention something regarding the maintenance. So if you're renting the facility and the landlord is responsible for maintenance, you cannot use the ESG/CV funds. So it's important to know what is in the lease, what party is responsible for what, so that you can know if the ESG/CV funds are eligible. And as Shavonna mentioned before, with the vaccine incentives, you cannot pay them retro. They must be paid within the same timeline as when the program participant received the vaccine. Next slide, please. So for your PPE, you want to make sure again that you have your invoices, any receipts, any purchase orders that you may have, and the proof of payment. Again, canceled check, a bank statement is what we're looking for as the proof of payment. The same thing for the equipment, invoices, receipt. Do want to note for equipment that if a procurement is required, you want to make sure that you have followed the procurement process before you enter into any sale contract with your vendors. For the hygiene stations, if it's a value of 5,000 or more per unit, you want to make sure that you do document the compliance, the procurement requirement. Next slide, please. So your supplies. Supplies do require procurement process as well. With that is not just going with the lowest vendor. There's a whole new process, and I believe we will be having a procurement training where we go into detail on how that works. But you want to, again, make sure that you are following this process before you actually, contract with your vendors. For food, again, invoice, as you can see, there's a pattern with these supporting documents. You can either have the invoice or the receipt, but when it comes to the actual proof of payment, we need to see that those expenses were actually paid. So if something was purchased on credit, you would need to pay that credit first before you can ask for the reimbursement. For the transportation, you may be asking what does that look like? If you are, purchasing public, using public transit, or your participants are using public transit, then you would actually need to save those receipts from those purchases so that you can, submit those when you submit the reimbursement. And again, for transportation, we know in the rural areas that public transportation may not be an option. And so, private transportation is eligible, such as an Uber or Lyft, or you may have, contracted with a taxi service that would be eligible to use ESGCV funds for that. Next slide, please. Your hazard pay, your training, your moving costs, again, very important that you are saving those receipts. Again, like Shavonna said, it tells a story. So that's exactly what we're looking for. If, you may no longer be at the agency, or you may get promoted to a different position, you want to make sure that those documents are there for when, the next person comes along and need to submit a reimbursement, that they can follow along and see the expense. They can see that it was paid, and then they can go ahead and ask for reimbursement on those. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it back over to Shavonna for this slide.
Thank you, Marion. Still continue with supporting documentation. If you are using ESGCV funds for the phone and internet, it must be very well documented with proof of the bill/receipt invoice. And also it's important to notice that if you are splitting using that phone and internet between different funding sources, you must be able to show in which the percentage is being used for ESGCV. Your travel is your transportation. Your transportation, again, this can include your mileage documented for your staff, lease or purchase of a vehicle. And then your rent. The rent on this slide is for rent costs for program participants that must be documented. You must ensure that if you're paying for a program participant's rental assistant, you must have a lease, and that lease must be fully executed by both the landlord and the program participant. Next slide, please. This is your renter's insurance. Your renter's insurance for program participants. If you are paying renter's insurance for your program participant, this must be paid directly to the insurance company. When we know sometimes that they do it in terms, and so the only difference, you must pay it to the insurance company. You cannot pay this to the leasing office. The next is the security deposit for program participants. Again, you want to document this with the lease. Again, you can only pay up to 2 months, 2 months times the rent for your security deposit. Next slide, please. And I will turn it back over to Marian.
Thank you, Sir Shavonna. All right, so we are winding down. The next slide, please. Okay, utility deposit and utility payment. Please note that these are 2 separate line items. So your utility deposit, again, based on the utility company, what they required. And I know sometimes this is an electronic payment. So you can go ahead and print out what the utility deposit requirement was. That way you can use that as an actual invoice, or the receipt when you submit your reimbursement, if you don't actually have a physical bill from the utility company. And utility deposits are sometimes, even if the participant have another source that will be paying the ongoing rent, they may be eligible for a utility deposit, because this is due before you actually move, usually due before you actually move into a unit. The utility payment, this can be ongoing. Again, in your policy and procedure, you would have what the time frame may be that you plan to assist participants with the utility payment. And so you would need a certification that the program participant has not received any other financial assistance. You don't want to, duplicate any benefits that may be provided, or, be provided more than is required. Next slide, please. Rental application fees. Again, this is something that you may need to assist the participants with. So you would find out from the landlord, the property manager, what this amount is. It should be the amount that's being asked of any applicant, regardless or not they are getting any assistance. And so, landlord, property manager should not ask for you to pay more in an application fee just because they know that you are providing, assistance to the applicant. And again, make sure that no other financial assistance is being provided. Next slide, please. All right, we're going to wrap it up with our last poll question. And this is regarding retention timeframe of the required records. Subgrantees must retain copies of the required records at least how many years after the expenditure of the funds under the grant. So is this 10 years, 5 years, 15 years, or is there no minimum requirement? We'll just give it a few seconds for you to cast your votes. All right. See option 2 at 81%. We'll go ahead and close the poll. Next slide, please. And if you said option 2, you're correct. So after you have received payment for your last expenditure, you need to retain the records for at least 5 years. Next slide, please. All right, so we have come to the end of our training, our documentation training. I know we don't have a lot of time for questions, but did we have any questions that we need to address before we close out today's session?
So Marion, there are a few questions that we've actually also answered in the chat as well. So we'll just make sure that we provide those answers in writing when we send out the follow-up email. And we did have one question for Sarah. I don't know if you're still with us. About the ESG NOFA, wanting to know if counties can use HAP funds for matching.
Well, that would depend on whether or not HAP has any specific regulations or rules, statutes that state that it cannot be used. Without looking at the actual HAP rules and regulations, I wouldn't be able to answer that off the top of my head. But we can research it more. If you do need us to look it up, please make sure that you email the NOFA box and we'll get you a specific answer. We just have to actually research what HAP specifically states.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sarah. And then we have one more question, I think not related, that we haven't answered in the chat yet, from Sherry about submitting an expense from the last quarter that was not reported to this Q7 report. Are you referring to an RFF, Sherry, or do you want to unmute yourself to clarify real quick?
I'm referring to an expense that we did not submit for last quarter. We didn't submit a report for last quarter, so we're doing Q7, but can we use an expense that was made in last quarter and put it on Q7 report?
So for this Q7 report, you're only reporting on what you submitted and what was approved for reimbursement. So if you did not submit an RFF this quarter,
No, we did not.
HCD, then you do not have to worry about reporting numbers for this quarter. You'll still report your annual year-to-date numbers for all of the previous quarters RFFs that have been approved.
Okay, I thought we were just reporting from April to June. Is that correct?
On the job form, there's columns
Yes.
for April through June and then also for year-to-date. So,
Okay,
so you'll still have to fill in the year-to-date numbers.
okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that will wrap up today's session, Erin, if there are no other questions.
Yep, no other questions for us. Thank you.
Okay.
Any other
Have a
closing
good day.
thoughts, Marion or Shavana? Are you all are done?
We do not. Thank you so much for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.